Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our global audience from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of them as we can. My guest today is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor is an internationally known Indian diplomat, politician, writer, public intellectual who served as an Indian Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala since 2009. He was formerly Under Secretary General of the United Nations, a well-known novelist, orator with a wide grasp of Indian and world politics. Please welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Good to be with you. How are you?
Good to hear you. Good morning. Namaste. How are you? Kaise mizaj hain? Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you again. And it's good evening here, but good morning to you.
Okay. Listen, I want to get started right away because you're in the middle of attending Parliament. Your time is short. So I'll go on. Let me start by asking you, Shashi, how would you explain India's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war? Americans expected that India, the world's largest democracy, growing trade partner, security partner with the U.S., would automatically support America in this war. So what do you think?
Well, I think, frankly, I was probably the only voice in the Indian political space for quite some time that spoke out against the stand India initially took on the Ukraine invasion. Frankly, didn't call it invasion. And I denounced the first couple of Indian statements, which struck me as rather excessively mealy-mouthed. Thereafter, there's no question that India has corrected its stance. It has officially and overtly condemned the violation of state sovereignty, the transgression of borders, it has reiterated the inadmissibility of the use of force in international affairs to settle disputes, but it hasn't explicitly condemned Russia. And for that, I think the reasons are probably twofold. One is certainly that there's a long series of friendly gestures from Russia, from the Soviet Union, as it once was, for decades, supporting India on a number of important geopolitical issues at the United Nations and elsewhere, and serving as an effective check towards China in such moments as the 1971 war with Pakistan. And Russia, therefore, has understandably a soft spot in Indian hearts that it's earned through its own conduct over the years. So there's even like an accumulated series of actions that have promoted a sense of gratitude that will not just be lightly shredded. The more practical consideration has been India's long-term dependence on Russian weaponry at a time when the West wasn't prepared to sell India such weapons.
Shashi, sorry, I'm interrupting you. We seem to have a little bit of breakdown. You come in and out on your line. I wonder if there's any way to quickly just check it. I mean, we can keep going.
I'm truly sorry. I think this is about the best my Wi-Fi can do.
Okay.
Am I audible at all? Or
you are audible. You are audible. Every other sentence seems to break down a bit, but I think we can pretty much catch the gist of what you're saying.
Let me see if I can just turn off my headset and speak directly into the computer in case the problem is with the Bluetooth. Sorry about this. I know you're live and we're wasting time.
Not at all. I mean, this is.
I can't hear anything else. Can you hear me now that I've returned?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, so I was just repeating, first of all, that there's a long series of IOUs with first the Soviet Union, thereby by extension to Russia.
Yes.
And the second, there's also a history of dependence on Russia for military equipment, and in particular for vital weaponry the West was unprepared to sell to India for many years. At one point, 85% of India's defense supplies came from Russia. Over recent years, that's gone down to about 45%. but the older equipment still needs to be serviced, spare parts are required, and so on, and you don't just lightly antagonize or break relations with such a crucial supplier at a time when you have a tough border in a tough neighborhood. You have the Chinese to the north who have killed 20 of your soldiers as recently as 2 years ago in an unprovoked border clash, and you have Pakistan to your northwest, which has fought 4 wars with India. So in these circumstances, a defense supplier and a defense supplier can't be taken lightly. So these are the two major reasons. But at the same time, I would say that geopolitics has its own logic. India, as I say, is in a tough neighborhood. It can't entirely afford to sort of turn against Russia, it feels, and see Russia falling completely into the Chinese embrace. I, as a critic of the Indian government stand, and having understood all of this, have still said that we're still backing the wrong horse. First of all, because what the Russians did is simply wrong. And if we stand for the principles in international affairs, there's no way we can countenance a blatant invasion of a sovereign state like this. Second is the concern that whatever happens in the war, thanks to the accumulated pressure of sanctions and the depletion caused by the war itself, Russia will emerge weakened. And when it's a weakened Russia, it'll be even more dependent on the one country that's determined to be a patron of it, namely China. So Russia dependent on our biggest and most hostile adversary is not going to be a Russia that's very much used to us as a geopolitical check or counter to China, as it has been in the past. So for all these reasons, I've been saying to the Indian government, I said this in Parliament, and I've said this in my public appearances, I think we are on the wrong side of history, and we need to actually recalibrate our position.
And so I'm just going to repeat parts of what you said. You basically made the point that that you've made yourself known. India's on the wrong side of history because if things keep going the way they are, Russia will be weakened, and that is not good for Indian geopolitics anyway, because that raises a whole other set of issues and so on. So in your view, I was going to ask you, Shashi, what has India, you think, done right in this fight and not so right? And from the sounds of it, you say that India has largely stood by some of the sanctions, but it needs to be a little more forthright in its views. Is that pretty much where you are? If you were to think about what
more than that, because I should acknowledge as a politician that there is a strong support from public opinion and political opinion on the whole for the government's present calibrated stand, which is that it has been friendly to Ukraine. It has supplied over 90 tons of relief materials to that beleaguered country. It has kept its communication lines open with President Zelensky and his people, while at the same time it's purchasing essential supplies of fuel and fertilizer from Russia at discounted rates, and that obviously goes over well at a time when our fuel prices are at record highs in India and the rupee is at a record low against the dollar. So all of this means that the Indian government has to pay attention to the economic realities that the Indian public is dealing with. But I would say that our diplomatic stand and our decreasing reliance on Russia do not place India completely in Russia's camp either. Where I feel that this could have led us more usefully to is as a more effective peacemaker. But for the moment, India has not taken any peace initiative, unlike countries like Turkey, Israel, and briefly France, who've tried to try and promote peace settlements. India has not done so, even though when Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was in Delhi, he suggested that India could help support a mediation process. We haven't done that, and that's, I think, because the Indian decision makers believe that there is no genuine political support on either side of this war for a peace settlement. I think both Ukraine and Russia seem to think that they can prevail, and so they're continuing, I'm afraid, to continue this conflict. And India, as a result, doesn't have a particularly useful role to play, other than trying to balance both ends against the middle.
Do you, Shashi, think it's a mistake for the West to characterize this war as a war between democracy and authoritarianism?
Yeah. Well, it's a challenge. The problem is that the democracies have not consistently, unfortunately, stood by the side of all democracies. In other words, an authoritarian state, many authoritarian states, were okay as long as they were on our side, as it were. America's long history of friendship with Latin American dictatorships, African dictatorships, and so on, does not particularly, I'm afraid, lead us to the conviction that it's always all democracies on one side, all authoritarians on the other. It's, my authoritarian is okay, an authoritarian hostile to me is not. That's part of the problem. India, on the other hand, has never been an evangelist for democracy, despite having impeccable democratic credentials.
Hmm.
It has essentially said to the other countries, look, if you need our help on anything, we're happy to help. So, for example, India's election commission, which has experience of conducting independent elections for the largest electorate in the world, is frequently invited by new and transitioning democracies to come and guide them in setting up free and fair elections in their country. And we quietly go and do that. But we don't go around saying, our way is the best way, come to us and learn from us. That's not been the Indian style at any point. So India will say that, yes, we support democracy, we're happy to support democracy, but we don't necessarily buy the idea that democracies automatically are always on the side of the angels and the authoritarians are always inimical to our interests. And that's perhaps problematic. I think people in the West would find that difficult to accept in the 21st century. But sometimes, for example, when we look, for example, at the 71 war with Pakistan, which led to the freedom of Bangladesh, the authoritarian communist dictatorship Russia was on the side of the victims, the Bengalis who were being butchered in a genocidal campaign, and the Western Democrats in Washington were supporting the military dictatorship in Pakistan that was conducting the genocide. So, you have to understand that India is a little reluctant from its own historical experience to see unbridled virtue in all democracies and, shall we say, unbridled evil in all authoritarian states.
Well, that's very well put and very diplomatically put, if I might add. But and I ask you that question because there is a feeling among some intellectuals, think tankers here in America, Sashi, that because of the war being framed as a war between democracy and authoritarianism, is the reason why a large part of the world has not joined the West in condemning Russia. Do you think there's something to that?
No, actually, I think that's the least of the problems, Saror, because honestly, people like to be on the side of the angels. And if democracy is an admired concept, you find the North Koreans calling themselves the People's Democratic Republic and so on. So I don't think that the mere label is going to put anybody off. I think there are practical reasons. Many countries, as I said, including India, have found Russia supportive of them in the past and therefore are reluctant to turn against a one-time friend or mentor. Other countries have practical, tangible relations. You know that Mr. Lavrov has been through Africa quite recently. And a significant number of African countries have refused to join the condemnation of Russia, partially because, indeed, they feel that some of their interests are aligned more with the Russian side than with the US side. So it depends. But India has a particular problem. If Russia's biggest patron is China, and the biggest gainer from a weaker Russia is China, and China is the country that's camped on our borders, that has occupied territory it never did 2 years ago, that has killed our soldiers, and that is essentially threatening to put us in our place. What are we doing supporting a state of affairs that strengthens, indirectly or otherwise, China? I mean, this is a question that people are asking quite objectively. I would say if every country looks to its own interest, you can find the virtues of our Indian government policy purely in terms of Indian national interest. But you can also find credibility in my critique of Indian government policy, also anchored purely in Indian national interest, which is, in my view, our interest in holding our own against China.
And so, Sashi, which leads me directly into this whole question of the rights-based world order. There's much said about this world order that was created, led by America mostly since the Second World War, how it's kept the peace, how it's improved everyone's economy, and so on. All of that is probably true, but do you think that this rights-based world order needs to be recalibrated, that there should be some way to rethink it, because after all, India, especially, the third largest economy, if I may say that, and China, the largest economy, were not part of the deliberations and so on. And I just wondered, you're a real intellectual with a global optic. What do you think?
Well, so this is an issue I've been thinking about a lot, because honestly, I find we're living in an era where our societies are increasingly becoming fractured, where questions of identity and ideology appear to be driving us farther away from each other. And at a time when there is a vacuum created by the absence of a collaborative brand of leadership worldwide. So what is the future of multilateralism, of this world order you described, the liberal international system that was established in 1945 at the end of the Second World War? We were not far away, not long ago, we were celebrating globalization, we were celebrating greater integration of countries, countries being willing to give up their sovereignty to come together. And both the backlash against globalization following the recession of 2008, and then the COVID pandemic and the sudden realization by many countries that their own governments and their own people were the first priority, and not any woolly-minded internationalism or multilateralism or cosmopolitanism for that matter. All of that has created a set of rather nationalistic, isolationist, protectionist regimes in most countries around the world. When Trump can go around and slogans of America first and make America great again, what's the example he sets to the rest? And when you've got a host of others, from Bolsonaro, Brazil, Erdogan, Turkey, Orban in Hungary, and for that matter, Mr. Modi in India, are successfully persuading their voters that they represent an authenticity in their own countries that is preferable to the allegedly ruthless secular cosmopolitans whom they've sought to displace. You're seeing changes in every country. You're seeing it now rising in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in France. All of these things, it seems to me, and these are countries where that movement has not succeeded, but which is it's become a potent force, a strong number two in all those countries. So
Right.
You're looking at situations in which, honestly, I think the whole idea that borders are less relevant, sovereignty can be pooled for the benefit of humanity as a whole, the world is moving inevitably towards greater integration, that's out. I think we're looking at the emotional appeal of nationalism. I think the liberal international order is on the defensive. We're seeing borders becoming more rigid, and everywhere there's a notion of us versus them, between societies and within societies. I'm seeing it in my own country, where from a 70 years of celebrating the commonality and coexistence of different religious groups, there's now a very strong emphasis on political polarization along religious group lines within the Indian political space. We're seeing isolationism and protectionism, as I said, embraced more enthusiastically in countries that used to preach the opposite. So, and the pandemic have reminded us that much of what was seemingly knitting the world ever closer together is actually vulnerable. Even the free trade system that knitted the world economy together since 1980, shaken by the financial crash of 2008-9, and then the Trumpian trade war with China, has been so badly exacerbated by the pandemic and the resulting complications in supply chains and all of that, I think we are all in trouble right across the board. What's going to come in the place of that liberal order is far from clear. And I think the Ukraine war that the Russians have inflicted, not just on the Ukrainians, but on the world, I would say, because of the horrendous consequences the world is facing from that war in terms of food shortages, inflation, fuel price increases, all of that's affecting developing countries that have very little to do with either Ukraine or Russia, but suddenly they're facing the consequences. All of this makes a clear pattern for the future extremely unpredictable.
And so, where does that take us? I mean, should there be another Bretton Woods? Do you think, or does this just have to play out, Shashi? We're at a part of this trajectory that just needs to play out. I mean, someone pointed out that the West is 12% of the population of the world. The rest is outside the West. And
Right.
here we have people that are going to suffer enormously, hunger, famine, and so on with this war. So where does this take us? What is the next step that we can all take, countries of the world, to try to make sense of this and change it? Or can we not do anything? It has to play out.
No, I mean, you knew me when I was at the United Nations, and I still feel that we should have had more out of the United Nations during this crisis. I wrote a piece which I know caused some offense in New York, saying that when the Americans and the Brits were declaiming from rooftops for 7 weeks that the Russians were about to invade, the Secretary General should have got on a plane and gone to both Moscow and Kiev at that time to forestall the war. Kofi Annan did that when Clinton was threatening to bomb Baghdad the first time in '98. He flew to Baghdad. I was there with him. And I can tell you that that's what we expect from a Secretary General, is to try and stop calamities like this happening before they happen. He did eventually make a trip to both capitals, but by then it was too late. The stable door, as it were, was wide open and the horse had bolted. Now we're looking at a situation where no one is credibly attempting a peace settlement, and certainly not least of all the UN Secretary General or the UN system. What I can hope for would be that when this war eventually ends, either by its own steam or because Russia decides it's got what it wants and wants to hold on to, or Ukraine actually manages to push the Russians out, or whatever. When this war ends, we would then, I think, need a major international conference, which I believe can only be convened by the United Nations, at the United Nations, to sit down and redesign world order. Clearly, what we have and what we've had for 75 years is lying in shattered shards at the moment. And I don't see how we can put Humpty Dumpty together. We will have to reinvent this particular wheel.
Well, I'm smiling only because you and I have known each other since your United Nations days, and have lived through all of those conversations about why should Britain be a permanent member, why should France be a permanent member, given India's rising heft and others. And I was just smiling when you said after the Ukrainian war ends, we'll all have to get together to sort this out. Of course, we're going to go right back to that issue that people that have power don't wish to give it up, right, Shashi?
That's true, but what use is that power if we can't actually leverage it around the world? I mean, the truth is that the pandemic was already a mega shock to the global system. We've seen sovereignties reasserted across the world, treaties and trade agreements increasingly questioned, and multilateralism very clearly a casualty. You saw Britain withdrawing from the European Union. You saw America leaving the landmark Paris Climate Agreement. You saw President Trump putting the US out of WHO. I mean, you've already seen some rather alarming trends which have justified your question about the future of the liberal world order. And I have to say that this phenomenon of deglobalization, which has been occurring in recent years, has also had its regional counterparts. I mean, I'll give you one example. Europe was once seen as a poster child for the virtues of regional integration, but it's become, under the pandemic, the epitome of its limitations, because the idea of Europe crumbled very quickly under the onslaught of the pandemic. The famous Schengen visa and the notion of border-free movement was the first casualty of COVID-19. Yes. EU countries threw up the barriers of the first sign of the virus. It didn't take them long to discover the disadvantages of the very free movement of goods, services, capital, and people that they had sworn by for 5 decades. In fact, you remember early in the pandemic, Italy, which was the first major victim of the COVID-19 crisis in Europe, was denied medical equipment by its EU neighbors, who introduced export controls instead of extending solidarity to their fellow Europeans in distress. So, I mean, I just have seen with mounting horror and concern a series of things from the 2008-9 recession to the pandemic itself, and now to the Russia-Ukraine war, that is fundamentally destroying the basic assumptions that I spent 29 years at the UN celebrating and promoting.
So the end of history has not yet come.
Oh, history is never going to end. So I think Professor Fukuyama knows that. It was a catchy title. It's all in the
Yes.
It's a books, but I don't think it's never ending. In fact, very soon after he published the book, when the sort of Soviet straitjacket was lifted off many Eastern European countries, history turned around and bit everybody in the leg and said, "I'm not dead yet." You had the Georgian Civil War, you had the Yugoslav Civil War, you had crisis after crisis in the former Soviet Union, right after the publication of The End of History. So I don't think that title will be Mr. Fukuyama's proudest achievement.
Listen, in the time that we have left, we are running into the last 5 minutes or so. Sashi, I want to go back to something you had said. You know, all of us, especially those of us who were born in India, like I was, and so on, are quite concerned about this nationalist bent of Mr. Modi and his followers. And there have been so many articles in the American and European press on this. Uh, kind of we thought about all of this when Mrs. Indira Gandhi declared a dictatorship, became Empress of India, if I remember, and then people voted her out. India has this way of self-correcting. Do you think that that is still possible at this point
Well,
on the trajectory?
there are both views. I just, in fact, before this, said a painful conversation with a Muslim friend of mine who is convinced that it's irreversible, that there's a toxin that's been injected into the society that cannot be taken out again. I do believe, as you rightly said, Tharoor, that the self-correcting mechanisms of Indian democracy and of the Indian people, of Indian civilization, if you like, still have an opportunity to restore the harmony and coexistence that was at the root of the Indian experience. And I'm one of those voices in India that's continuing to work for that.
Yes.
Perhaps with greater hope than confidence, but we're doing our very best. Let me just perhaps finish the thought on the world system that we were on, because before you were
Absolutely.
that topic, I didn't want to leave you in a purely negative spirit, because I actually believe that the sheer complexity and immeasurability of our interdependence requires more global governance, not less. And I don't want to turn our backs on multilateralism, as perhaps my answer implied. In my 29 years at the United Nations, I learned that the world is a better place when countries engage in dialogue, when they have a forum to talk through the problems they share, rather than resorting to tit-for-tat responses on issues they disagree on. I know that in today's world, countries are turning their backs on such forums in their desire to reduce their exposure to external dangers. But I want to say that external forces do not only represent threats like the COVID pandemic did, they also involve opportunities that visionary leaders can and should seize. Because I believe that the only hope for the future of our planet lies in international solidarity. I think that when the current pandemic is over, we across the world must learn lessons about what happened, how international systems and institutions can be strengthened and radically reformed if necessary in order to forestall the recurrence of what we've seen. And I think the same can be said about the ongoing war and the sanctions. Instead of strengthening the capacity of our global institutions to cope with the future crisis, I don't want the world's reaction to the virus, to the war, to the economic situation, to end up destroying the most fundamental feature that the pandemic actually exposed, which is the idea of our common humanity. That virus affected us all, and we must be using it as a reminder not to throw up barriers between ourselves, but in the name of that common humanity, to find solutions. We've got to live and work together again, and I think that's something that I passionately believe and want to see happening in the future, whether or whatever shape it might take.
So, Shashi Tharoor, as we close this program with this bright view, inspiring view, I know Parliament is in session. You've taken some time to join Polaris Live. Deeply appreciate that. And so let me thank you once again. And I hope that we can do this again under some brighter circumstances, as they will undoubtedly come.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry that my headset let us down at the beginning, but I hope we've made amends for it since then.
Okay. Well, best of luck to you, and hopefully we get together again at some point.
All the best. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Unfortunately, we were a little bit disturbed by the internet connection. And I just decided we had to go on because Mr. Tharoor's voice, Dr. Tharoor's voice, is so important to where the world is today that I think we just had to go on and get it the best we can. We will try to have Dr. Tharoor back with us again. And I want to thank all of you who persevered, watched, and heard. I hope that you will join us again at a future Polaris Live program. And until then, goodbye.